I've got about 30, 40 minutes worth of slides, but this is assuming that you don't interrupt me, and I'll very much invite you to interrupt me if there's anything that you find particularly interesting. Um, so I'm going to basically do four things. Number one is I want to explore commonalities between gameplay and design. I also, as the second thing, want to look at a couple of ways in which gameplay and design are different. I want to go through some examples of how gameplay or interactive resources more generally have been combined with design in the past. I'm going to show some examples that I have been involved in creating myself, but I'm also going to show some of other people or some that I am actually um, drawing on in my own teaching that were designed by other people. And finally, I'm going to spend about 3 slides on general frameworking and some in principle possibilities that I see you have in putting together these ideas. The Playful Cardkit on the one side, and then design and the theory of Thomas Maldonado on the other hand. What I will not do in this presentation, and I hope that's okay, I don't want to give you concrete guidance as to what you should do in your project. I understand that you are at the beginning of your project and relatively early in your semester. So I'm not trying to push you into particular directions or to give you a particular instructions as to how you should approach your projects. I want to keep this open and deliberately vague, which I think might also help in as far as you come from different levels of study. I will also not give you an introduction to games design. There are now some pretty good resources out there. I've already shared some books with Dr. Pereira, but instead I want to explore the world of design and the world of gameplay on an equal footing. Yeah, so not one necessarily being subject to the other, but how the two might relate to each other in maybe more symmetrical ways. And finally, what I'm also not going to do is I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the philosophy of Thomas Maldonado. And with that, I also leave you in the hands of Dr. Pereira. I'm just going to look specifically at what's going on in the design process, what's going on in gameplay processes, and how these two worlds can possibly come together productively. Okay, so as I said, I want to start with an exploration of commonalities and differences between gameplay and design. And that's going to take the biggest chunk of my time. So first commonality is this notion of curiosity and exploration, and that both gameplay, and design are experiences that we seek because there is some promise of excitement in it or some kind of reward in some type of process. So that's number one. And I'm basically now going to walk you through a vocabulary of these notions, beginning with curiosity of exploration, of notions that could become potential pivoting points to move back and forth between design and gameplay and to potentially connect them. Another one, very importantly, is the notion of time. This idea that there is something unfolding along the corridor of a timeline where the participants involved have a sense of progress and a sense of going somewhere. And with this comes the notion of a goal, both in gameplay and in design. Not exactly in the same way. I will say a little bit more about the special status of goals in design towards the end of the slideshow. But in one way or another, we are aiming somewhere in that passage of time along the process of both gameplay and design, and that there is something to be accomplished along the way, and that the bridge between the here and the there isn't quite there, that it has to be somehow explored or fabricated and constructed as we go. The next notion is the lure or the promise of success. Yeah, we engage in processes of gameplay and design because there is a promise or of some sort of reward in one way or another. Yeah, if we can um, successfully accomplish the goals that we have set for ourselves or that have been set for ourselves, then there is this um, uh, moment of reward and betterment, development, success in some form. And in either gameplay and design, we're in it and we're experiencing it as a kind of group thing. Yeah. So there are the notions of cooperation and collaboration and also competition. And typically, there are, especially on the design side nowadays, there's teamwork involved. But of course, there's also team sports and team games as well. Um, and then there can be collaboration within teams and there can be competition between teams. Now, let's talk more about what's happening within gameplays and design. An important ingredients, one of several ingredients that I want to cover is the idea of storylines or narratives. There is typically in games, but also in design, there are certain patterns that we keep telling each other about human experience, promises, challenges, and these are this is a commonality throughout various areas of human activity, but narratives and storylines come in very strongly when things get time-based. It's the same with uh, performative activities in general, theater, literature, film, and so forth. And in those cases, the narratives are structuring and they're also informing. Yeah? They're giving us an idea of what to expect. And they allow for some kind of continuity between different experiences of gameplay and different experiences of design in different contexts. Both activities also involve a mix, typically, of chance and skill. Yeah. So in gameplay or in game design related literature, what you will often read is that games are either designed on chance or skill, but actually more often than not, there is a mix of both. And you can say there is the same is true about design, that designing hinges to a certain degree on skill and experience, but there's also an element of luck and serendipity. And that's also a really interesting analogy between these two worlds. And then there is the idea of interaction and feedback. Yeah, this follows from the idea of both activities being often group activities, that there is an experience of the participant as a self encountering one or more others, and that within the group that there is some kind of back and forth or transactions or taking some sort of choreography in time of um, taking different activities that support and enhance each other. Both are also based on this notion of probing our differences. Um, I've tried to illustrate this here with these two images, the Minesweeper desktop game that maybe some of you know, where we're trying to probe what is unknown about the other. And in a game that is based on the differences between the self and the other, and the fact that I cannot really read the mind of the other. Yeah, that's an essential part of this play pattern. But something quite analogous comes into the design process, where creativity is driven by the ways in which we are not the same. There are differences between our vocabularies in the most essential sense, but our concepts, our understandings. And what that means is that as we converse in the design process, we may understand each other and we may not understand each other. And it is in particular in these moments of misunderstanding that we find inspiration, or that we find interesting aspects to explore. So we are not the same. We cannot see into each other's minds. And in general, that like in the world at large, this is usually perceived as a problem, but in both gameplay and design, um, it's essential, and it's a resource. It has value, and it is enjoyed, and it is exploited for the purpose of either enjoyment or creative production. Yeah, the fact that we are not the same has value. And speaking of value, we engage in both gameplay and design out of some kind of enjoyment of being together and of supporting each other and changing the world together in processes that we conduct socially. And this idea of value is in one way or another reflected along a broad spectrum of very ethereal values about human betterment and high like uh, greater goods, all the way down to very literal values such as the value of money in both the world of gameplay and in the world of design. Yeah, we in both areas we um, count money or points or some kind of equivalent as some measure of progress in a game, but in design we are adding value quite analogously also along a broad spectrum, going from material value to more idealistic or higher values. Obviously, in both domains, we enter worlds that are not there, but that we dream could be there. Yeah, and that takes some inspiration or imagination. And we structure experience and we structure our narratives using metaphors. And to illustrate that, I'm juxtaposing here, on the one hand, a board game that I'm sure you all know, which is based on the idea of a journey in a city or an economic activity in a city. So the board game is structured with some reference to a physical urban environment. And on the other hand, we have a customer journey map as a type of understanding of what the users of certain interaction, experience, service design outcomes might undergo. Yeah, so these are metaphors of journeys. There are other metaphors, but these metaphors are basic ingredients in the narratives through which we understand these processes. A little bit more abstract is the notion of myths. Yeah, games are fundamentally, in many instances, based on mythology in a very literal sense. Yeah, starting from Dungeons and Dragons. But if you will, the design process is also to a large degree determined by myths and ideas that many people subscribe to, but which become more plausible the deeper you are within the culture of design. And as a newcomer, you may not necessarily find them particularly convincing. So myths that we buy into are, for example, the myth of technological growth, or the myth of the need for economic growth and progress and so forth. So myths don't have to be um, questioned to be believed, and they don't even have to be um, conscious in our mind. It's enough for them to be unconscious or subconscious, but they still create common grounds for those who meet in these activities of gameplay and design. And similarly, again, along those lines of common ground, there are rituals. There are particular activities that are typically not questions, they are just understood to somehow be important, and they are performed because they are performed. Um, One of those rituals, for example, is the brainstorming with the post-it notes. That's kind of iconic and um, supposedly a key ingredient in good design. So those are some commonalities that I found interesting between these two domains. And in my attempt to look at design not as something that produces play or vice versa, but in looking at these two notions side by side and on an even footing. So now I want to look at a couple of differences. Yeah, these were the commonalities. Now let's look at the differences. Oh, actually, this is one more commonality. I confused the slide here apparently. So in the end, there's a reckoning in both gameplay and in design. Yeah, there was either success or not. We're getting away with it or not. We've either won or not. So there is not only the lure and the promise of success, but there's an actual accounting at the end where we see whether the outcome is successful, whether the goal is accomplished or not. And the general assumption is that hard work and good luck and good skill are favorable towards a successful outcome. Now, let's go back to the differences for sure. I just mixed up the previous two slides. Apologies for that. So a typical difference between gameplay and design is that games are typically played as closed systems, whereas design is typically open towards the world and what's going on in life at large. And to illustrate that, I have chosen an exception to that, which is the game of Truth or Dare, which is one of the few examples that I can think of a structured gameplay that is open to the rest of the world. Yeah, the players take turn, and then the dare is something that is performed in real life. And whenever that happens, the closed system of the structured play breaks up for a moment, and someone has to perform. Some player has to perform something in the world. Yeah, and I'm using this as a rare exception. This normally doesn't happen. When you play Monopoly, it doesn't affect your real life bank account. Yeah, so it stays a closed system and it doesn't affect the world. Design, by definition, is taking the opposite approach. It aims at making a change in the world. It doesn't it's not self-centered with a purpose within itself that doesn't play out outside of the boundaries of its own process. Another difference has already been mentioned before by Dr. Pereira, and that's the difference between wicked and tame problems, and the fact that games and their by way of being structured around rules very typically constitute tame problems. And Riddle and Weber, if I remember correctly, they actually refer explicitly to the game of chess as uh, as a tame problem, not because it's trivial or because it's particularly easy to play, but because there's a very clear understanding of whether a move performed is consistent with the rules, and when and whether the game was won and by whom, and the fact that the game is completed at a certain point. These are all attributes of chess and of many card games, board games, computer games, and so forth, where the existence of rules is by definition a taming of that world. And because design is open to the world, aims at affecting lived experience of actual people, where there are many moving parts at play, many different perspectives and values and competing strategies and approaches to accomplish goals. We're looking at wickedness in the social domain of design. So that's probably one of the most important differences between these two domains. I already mentioned the notion of goals earlier, and with this difference of wickedness of gameplay and tameness of gameplay and wickedness of design comes also the a difference in the notion in the nature of the goals we're dealing with. In gameplay, the goals are fixed. In design, goals tend to be negotiable. Quite literally, when you open a box for a board game and you look at the instructions, it might actually start, the first sentence might start with the objective of the game is, and then the end of that sentence is a non-negotiable goal that the players have to strive for by following the rules. So in gameplay, the goals are typically fixed. In design, that's different. And there is some literature looking at how in design the brief or the challenge or the question or the problem is not fixed. And there are some papers that refer to this nature of design, or this aspect of design, in analogy to biological co-evolution. That's why I've included this strange image here. Co-evolution refers to the idea that in the change of biological species over time, we have observed that evolution does not respond to fixed and static environments, which is pretty much how Charles Darwin described evolution, but that other species are parts of the environment of any evolving species. And that as a result of that, different species can co evolve and change together. Yeah, this is shown here in the relationship between the beak of the bird and the shape of a flower that has co-evolved with that bird. So they exist together, and we can actually see how in their shape they have evolved to make sense together. In the design process, we have something very similar, where we might start with a problem statement or with a brief, with a challenge. And as the designers engaged in that process understand more through that process, they might find themselves in a position to ask a better question, or to define a better problem. So the question doesn't only affect the answer also has an effect potentially on the question. Or in other words, the problem doesn't necessarily have an own does not only have an effect on the goal, but there are temporary goals which can lead to a reformulation of the problem. Yeah, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but there is a type of joke that asks how many dot 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 does it take to screw in a light bulb? Have you heard about those jokes? Yeah, okay. So I this this I've heard those jokes in English only. So you ask how many dot 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 does it take in to screw in a light bulb, and then there's some kind of uh, disparaging punchline about that type of person. So the one about designers goes like this, where you ask, how many designers does it take to screw in a light bulb? And the answer is, does it have to be a light bulb? So rather than coming up with some strategy for screwing in a light bulb, going back and questioning the premise of the joke. And that's exactly what designers do. Rather than accepting the brief as an immovable object, we challenge it. And that's something that we don't do in games typically. And that's where the analogy between gameplay, that's one of the ways in which the analogy between gameplay and design falls apart. Um, and typically it's taken as very bad sportsmanship to try to renegotiate the rules of a game halfway through the game. But design is doing that habitually. So now let's look at a couple of examples of how gameplay and design have been related to one another. These relationships that I'm now going to show are actually very different from one another, as you will see. And they can, of course, be constructed through various media and through various kinds of play patterns. I just happen to have a couple of examples based on card decks, but of course, that doesn't mean that you are supposed to do a card deck. Yeah, you can explore um, the resource that you are going to develop uh, much more broadly. So the first example that I have here are the oblique strategies by Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt. Have you seen these before? Have you gone through some examples? Maybe not. So Brian Eno is a famous music producer. He was behind most of the music of David Bowie, for example, and he came up with the concept of ambient music. Um, he has also written a really interesting diary called A Year with Swollen Appendices, where he's got tons of musings on his own creative process and how, with what kind of artists he likes to collaborate with and why. So that's a really interesting casual read if you are interested in that sort of thing. And some of the creative strategies or perturbations that he apparently finds useful in his own practice, he has formalized together with Peter Schmidt in a set of cards. And as you will see, it's a very minimalist deck of cards. I don't know off the top of my head how many cards are in there, but it could probably be 100. You can buy them, but you can also download them. I actually have the PDF from which they are printed. If you can't find it, I'll be happy to share these and all the other resources that I'm referring to later. And I will also give you these slides. Later, there will be some internet references that you may want to take a look at, and I can give you this whole package of material. So the deck doesn't come with any rules, really. It's just a resource that in the design process or in a creative process more generally, you can refer to. And it is very vague in many ways. So there are some slides that contradict each other. And there are, so not slides, there are some cards that contradict each other. And there are also some cards that contradict themselves, or that at least have a contradiction within themselves. For example, the one that we see here in these examples in the lower left, destroy nothing, the most important thing. Yeah, which as a creative person drawing this kind of card from a stack, you can interpret in many ways. Yeah, it could mean destroy nothing and the most important thing. It could mean destroy nothing or the most important thing, or it could just mean imagine your project without the most important thing. It's quite vague. It's quite informal, but many of them are also quite scary. Yeah, destroy the most important thing is a really scary thought to most designers. I would guess. Emphasize differences. Be dirty. How would you have done it? Simple subtraction. There are actually also different editions of this over the years. I have a set that has a card that just says gardening, and that card I don't exist anymore in the current edition. So it changes a little bit with time, and it's a playful resource. And the fact that it doesn't have rules and it doesn't require structured play is, I think, interesting and potentially liberating for people who find themselves in the kind of situation that you are finding yourselves in, where you want to bring together different worlds, and the potential challenge of making this fusion work in a structured and formal way. It shows you that it doesn't have to work in a structured and formal way. There are actually more patterns of play than structured play. I will refer to that again in a moment. So the next example that I have is also not a set of cards in the sense that you're supposed to play with them in a particular way. Um, but it is highly structured. This comes from the environmental engineering company Arup. Those of you who work in the area of architecture may be more likely to be familiar with this company. It's actually quite a large company with offices in major cities around the world, and they do urban infrastructure architectural type projects. And a couple of years ago, they have started publishing this book, or this box, I should say, of cards titled Drivers for Change. And I believe there's also a couple of editions now that accounts for changes and changes in global trends, but it basically looks at major areas of global development from demographic shifts, migration, water shortages, climate change, waste management, transportation. And each card has a front side and a back side. One side is an illustration of the issue in a broad sense, and the back side typically has some more detailed information, statistics, and suggestions as to how the world is going to change under these influences. Yeah. So again, this is not something that users are expected to play with in a structured way, but designers can certainly come up with patterns of using these cards of their own and of um, taking account and responding to the changing world within which their products are going to perform by reference to these drivers of change. There is another card deck that I just thought about that I actually didn't think about when I put those slides together. It is called the IDEO method cards. Do you know that? So that's the IDEO is a product design or a product innovation company in Silicon Valley in California. And a couple of years ago, they have started publishing also a card deck, again not intended for structured play in the narrow sense, but it's a collection of design research methods. So I didn't think about this before, but it just comes to my mind now. I'll be happy to share a scan of that deck of cards with you. It is grouped into 4 groups. Yeah, I just looking at the filing tabs over here, I was thinking of some playing cards, um, and I realized that the IDEO method cards are also structured in a similar way into 4 categories, and the 4 categories in that case kind of correspond to the 4 stages of the British Design Council's double diamond model of the design process that maybe some of you know. So those cards fall into 4 different categories, and they are methods about soliciting information in early design stages. So they, for example, there's a card looking at shadowing users. There's a card about rapid ethnography. There's a card about interviewing extreme users. There's a card about role playing, about body storming. And each of the cards has, similar to the drivers of change, an illustrative image on the one side, and then on the back side some structured information about when that particular research method might be a good idea, when it might not be a good idea, what are its advantages, what are its disadvantages, when in the design process should it be used. Again, it's a resource that can be used playfully, It creates a very strong relationship, obviously, between design and play, or the notion of a playful resource. But it doesn't expect structured play in a strict sense. I should have included that one. Yeah, it's called the IDEO method cards. And it's an interesting response about limitations about methods in the context of design that have been noted in the past. Maybe some of you know that there was, for about 10 years, a movement called the design methods movement that tried to establish rational methods for the design process, which kind of failed. And now that kind of method that we talk about now, there's a couple of books that have come out recently, mainly out of the Netherlands, that offer methods after methods have failed and after methods have been rejected, because those methods that we are talking about recently are not really instructing designers about how they should design. They are more informative in terms of how designers can better appreciate contexts of use and expectations of users. Yeah, so they are more about information gathering and analysis than they are about synthesizing novelty and new solutions. And so there's a whole history of learning about limitations of methods in some areas of design, um, and some areas that are left, for which we now have methodology literature, but also card decks. Um, the drivers of change that we're looking at here don't even go as far as suggesting methodology. They're just taking account of how the world is changing, and they're offering a distilled um, a distilled collection of information that designers can refer to very effectively without having to go through tons of literature or video, and everything is very compact and quickly digestible within a design process. Yeah, and in each of these cases, playful strategies can be used amongst designers, where one is just maybe holding up a deck of cards, asking the other, pull a card, and then there's this element of chance that I have mentioned before. Um, yeah, that's how card games afford chance, by basically allowing you to shuffle the deck of cards, and randomness involved in pulling individual cards, analogous to how we are using dice and similar objects in board games. So there, nonetheless, there is an element of play or playfulness, but not in a formal, structured sense here, where we would, as we would expect, where we encounter rules. So here's another one. It's called Know Your Process. That is literally a game, and it comes with rules, and it basically gamifies typical, if you want, mythical. Yeah, when we go back to the metaphors and the myths that I have mentioned before, this game takes myths of the design process quite literal, and it creates a play experience based on the metaphor of the design process. Yeah, so in playing this game, you are taking the perspective of a designer in a process, and you have to overcome typical mythical or real design challenges, um, for which that are well known in the context of design. So you have, as various experiences in the game, you draw cards, and they basically determine your fate. Yeah, they give you a moment, or a fortune or a misfortune, depending on what you draw, quite similar to the cards that you draw in Monopoly. So you're in a design process, and you have a deadline, and the printer is broken. or your computer gets hacked, or your client doesn't understand you. It takes these stereotypical design experiences and gamifies them around a set of rules. The process here is not to enable the design process or to inform a design process in the way that the drivers of change or the ideal method cards would. It's literally taking the design process as a journey and structures gameplay around it that is then enjoyed for its own purpose. Out of it's a competitive gameplay that doesn't promise to be productive in any way in a design context. These are 4 examples of a deck of 60 cards called trigger cards. They were designed by a student of mine in a master's program in Hong Kong about 10 or 11, no, oh God, 13 years ago. And so the designer's name is Karen Shaholi, and she created a deck of cards that are designed to offer perturbations and inspirations, again, in a very informal way in the design process. And here we don't actually have structured text at all. Each card only has one word on it or a very short phrase and a backside with an illustration. And the illustration sometimes enforces the keyword and sometimes uh, apparently contradicts it. Yeah, that's, for example, the emotion card has a printed circuit board on the back of it, which may not exactly be an obvious illustration of the idea of emotion, but it's very subjective and it's highly ambiguous. And Karen has actually done some fairly rigorous evaluations of this card deck in her own corporate context. And when she submitted this to me, she actually made a whole set of cards for me, which I have sitting on my shelf. I haven't actually used it myself, but as a part of the paper that she wrote about this, she asked me not to share the way she applies it in her corporate context and the outcomes of that. So, but I am free to share you how she put this deck of cards together, and I'm very happy that I can show it to you because it's a beautiful example of a very ambiguous and uh, unstructured, yeah, unstructured is the key word, perturbation that can be thrown in a design process, inviting designers to respond to these, what she calls triggers, in ways they see fit. Yeah, so we're actually very far away here from the notion of rules that are governed by games that are governed by rules. So I think this is the last example that I have. This is a deck of cards that a bunch of master students of mine have created in Taiwan. And the idea here is actually, again, not to play with these cards, but to use the format of a card deck just to collect and to share the work that has come out of an entire semester of thinking about design philosophy in a very general sense. So I basically took over this subject titled design philosophy, and there wasn't really a lot of structure around this subject. And at that point, one of the thoughts on my mind was that design students in particular, are often very determined to give correct answers, when I actually think that a lot of design is about asking good questions rather than giving correct answers. So I took that as a starting point to invite students to basically formulate a question that they find worthwhile investigating for themselves over a long period of time. And then we basically spent just 12 weeks talking about that in a group of, I don't know, maybe 16 or 20 students. And in the end, each student is represented as one card in this deck. And each card basically has a picture of the student, their name, a little bit about their study context, and then the question that they have formulated over the course of many weeks. And then some structured elaboration around 4 questions. Why is this question worth asking? How is this relevant to my studies? And how do I intend to address this question in the future? And yeah, there was basically one semester of intense discussions and a lot of agony of coming up with a worthwhile question that is not trivial to answer. So for example, is probably the one that is easiest to read on this slide is, when does a prepared mind stop being a receptive mind? In a design process, when is it preferable to design as a team, and when is it preferable to design individually? Yeah, so these are really hard questions for which there are not obvious answers, and which are really interesting to investigate and to set as personal agendas to keep an eye on over the course of a couple of years. And that's basically what this group of students has set themselves up to do. And in the end, the outcome was structured and produced as a deck of cards. Again, structured in terms of format, but not structured in the sense that there are rules that are asking for a particular pattern of play. Um, there are more of these. Yeah, this is a website that I found which has 21 card decks for creative problem solving and strategic foresight. Um, and on top of that, as I mentioned before, there are also the IDEO method cards, which are actually not listed on this particular webpage. And I'm sure if you Google cleverly, you will probably find more examples of um, interesting marriages between play of one kind or the other on the one hand, and design on the other hand. So now let's look at frameworks and potential ways of systematizing the relationship between design and gameplay. One of them is based on a conversation that Dr. Pereira and I had in preparation of today's meeting, which is basically a grid in which elements of Maldonado's philosophy are overlaid on a list of elements of gameplay. Not to fill this grid exhaustively necessarily, but again, with a view to potentially finding pivoting points, hinges where the one domain can cross over into the other. So this, or something like this, could potentially take on the role of a tool or a method, or a method for you. The next little framework that I want to propose was inspired by the title that Dr. Pereira gave me for today's talk, which has the word about in it, about design. I thought that was an interesting choice of terms. And I also notice that there is an interesting circularity potentially in this title and in the way that it positions the outcome and the process of what you are going to do in this semester. You are designing a resource about designing, which means you have a lot of options in terms of how you can bring these two domains together. Yeah, that's the good news. Maybe the bad news is that you are also facing potentially quite a confusing situation, because this wheel can spin and it might be a little bit disorienting, acting between these two interpretations or these two ways of ends and means, of putting ends and means together. But looking at this word about, I had to think about a categorization of design research that was proposed almost 20 years ago by Christopher Freiling in an article titled Research in Art and Design. Again, maybe some of you are familiar with this. This is one of the more frequently cited um, pieces of literature in the context of design research. Freiling says that there are basically three ways in which research and design can come together. The first is research about design. Yeah, that is basically the empirical approach. Just like scientists can study bacteria or galaxies looking through microscopes or telescopes, so is it possible for scientists to look at what designers do. Yeah, and in this relationship, research about design is the subject of empirical research. That's one kind. The second kind of research that he identifies is research for design, and that is research aiming at producing resources that have utility for designers in the design process. So if I program a CAD tool that you use in your creative process, then what I am doing would qualify as research for design. Yeah, this is typically R&D type development of resources that are then handed to designers to make their job easier or better or more informed. The third way, according to Christopher Freiling, in which research and design can come together, he calls research through design, which is basically any kind of innovative, creative development of propositions for changing in the world, any kind of design process. And the argument here is that if you have designed something, which therefore by definition is something new, then you must have learned something in that process. And from this follows that you have done research. Yeah, if you would not have learned something, you would not have done research. But since you have learned something in producing something new creatively, therefore, what you have done also qualifies as research. This last category is uh, a key point of discussion between design researchers and academic researchers about what qualifies as research. But Freiling's argument is that any process of design, by definition, leads to novelty and insight, and therefore constitutes an instance of research. And wherever that is happening, he talks about research through design. So that gives us these three modes that Freiling introduces: research about design, research for design, and research through design. This has been reframed and repackaged a couple of times. There's another author named Findeli There's also another one in Australia named Peter Downton. They have picked this up more or less around the same time, but Freiling was the first one. And sometimes they're using different terminology. I think Findeli says he uses the term research into design as opposed to research about design, but he means pretty much the same thing. But across different authors, we see the same um, taxonomy, if you will, of three modes in which research and design can come together. And that suggests that our circle on the left-hand side can actually come in three different flavors. And the title of this talk could as well be structured around the notions of for and through. Yeah. So I want to invite you to explore that as a potential framework for what you are doing. You may not necessarily end up um, creating a resource about design. Maybe the game you create is a resource for design, or maybe it is a resource that enables research through design. Yeah? So we see multiple ways in which um, design and gameplay can come together. And I just found it interesting to explore these three alternative ways of bringing research and design together as three modes in which gameplay and design can come together. Finally, I want to say a word about the distinction between free play and structured play. In various ways, I have hinted at that throughout my slide deck. And many of the examples that I have shown, yeah, the trigger cards, the um, drivers of change, as I said, they are not necessarily resources to be used as for structured play. They are open in the way that they want to be used. So that openness in play is referred to as free play. And paradoxically enough, free play has been structured into different categories. Uh, I have taken this diagram from a PhD thesis from Eindhoven Technical University from 5 years ago, and it distinguishes free play into explorative, performative, active, negotiative, and communicative play. And again, I think this is potentially a really interesting framework for you to explore and to look for commonalities between play, free play in this case, and design, which can also be explorational or communicative or negotiative. And maybe there is something interesting in those analogies for you. And finally, we can observe in the examples that I have shown that the world of design and play can be brought together along different structuring categories. Yeah, so play can describe design. Yeah, that's what the design process game is about. It's literally a game that describes the experience or picks up the experience of designers in the process. Play also in that same case mimics design. In the case of the drivers for change, in the case of the ideal method cards, clearly we are looking at attempts to use play to enable the design by offering background information about trends in the world or by offering methods to better understand and appreciate the perspective of users. Play can also perturb design, and I think that's what the trigger cards are trying to do. And maybe the design philosophy cards that I've shown towards the end of my examples is a good example of design being described through a playful resource, through a card deck. So this is a starting point of a vocabulary of different verbs that can act as interesting glue between these two domains. And maybe that too can be a framework for you to explore, potentially extend, and to use to bring these two domains together. And that brings me to the end of my slides, and I'll be happy to discuss this and to answer any questions you may have.